So we're talking about Catherine Mansfield today. The Poetry Foundation has said that she's one of the most talented writers of the modern short story in English, and I think many critics would agree with that. Mansfield only attempted one novel. It was called The Aloe, and that ultimately she turned into a short story called Prelude. So let's talk a little bit about Mansfield. Just a brief biography, because I think there's plenty of material that I've provided for you to consider on the web. But just a sketch. She was born Catherine Mansfield Beauchamp Murray in 1888 in Wellington, New Zealand. So she was a colonial subject of England. And that colonial consciousness doesn't particularly come out in the story that I've asked you to read, but it is a part of her work and consciousness. Her family was prominent in Wellington society. Her father was a successful banker and was ultimately knighted for his service to the country. But Mansfield didn't quite fit into this upper-class bourgeois family. At 19, she settled in London, though she was ultimately forced to warmer climates because of her tuberculosis. She lived a rather bohemian life and tried to set her own terms, so she was what we might call a modern woman. She died in 1923 in Fontainebleau, France, from tuberculosis, in fact, from a pulmonary embolism. And the biography I have here, and I've also got it on your agenda for this week, is a useful place to go to really get a greater sense of her biography. So in terms of our discussion of Mansfield, there's 3 points I want to focus on and I'll be asking about on the discussion board. And these are the qualities of her writing that I think make it most modernist, and she's the last modernist author we'll be reading this semester. One is the focus on the individual character and discrete moments of experience or insight that character has. This is so important to the modernists, and it's also critical to Mansfield's stories. They tend to pivot on the interior character and these moments of experience. Also, her use of stream of consciousness at these critical moments that get us inside of the individual experience of gender or class. And finally, her use of epiphany, what we today call epiphany, to convey a pivotal insight for the character. This was used by Joyce, it was used by Woolf. Many of the modernist authors were interested in these key moments of insight or revelation. So I want to look a little bit at that in Mansfield's work. Okay, so first, her interest in the individual character. She's like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, many other modernists in her interest in exploring a character's interior life rather than, say, developing a good plot. In fact, this turn to character and away from plot is also a turn away from Victorian, Edwardian, and realist narratives, which modernists felt reiterated known truths in an authoritative and sweeping portrait of society that modernists were just skeptical of. Mansfield was particularly interested in exploring the alienation or estrangement of a character from her known world. So, for example, thinking of The Garden Party, Laura's confrontations with the bourgeois culture of her upper-class family. There are several confrontations in this story, and they're all leading, again, to a sort of critical insight or aha moment at the end of the story. And this, by the way, is biographical fascination for Mansfield. Whether or not we could say that Laura is mapped in some way on her own family experience, there are many, many other examples of Mansfield herself feeling alienated from her family, and in fact she was estranged from them for much of her life. So that's the focus on the individual. I also want to think about her narrative style in terms of how it conveys gender and class issues. Of course, there's a great deal going on with her, but this is one of the points of interest that I want to emphasize. Her stories reflect the point of view and experience of women, often. And many of these women feel isolated or estranged from mainstream society. So, for example, again, if we think about Laura's emerging awareness of class bias, we can see this happening. Her mainstream society in this context might well be her family. And so when she suggests that they call off the party because of the death of the Carter, she's really butting up against their standardized way of doing things and, frankly, their class bias. And we experience this inside of her mind very often when Mansfield uses stream of consciousness. So typically her stories have a great deal of third person narrative, but they will often at critical moments shift into stream of consciousness, which allow us to enter a character's consciousness. So for example, at the moment in the text when Laura's on her way down to take food to the family, we see this shift into stream of consciousness. Laura bent her head and hurried on. That's typical sort of third person narrative. But it shifts into stream of consciousness. She wished now she had put on a coat. How her frock shone. And the big hat with the velvet streamer. If only it was another hat. Were the people looking at her? And so you see how we can go from third person to what we might call free indirect discourse. She wished now. So someone's telling us what she's thinking, but we're beginning to enter her frame, to a real stream of consciousness. How her frock shone. And the big hat with the velvet streamer. If only it was another hat. And now we're fully into Laura's consciousness and her experience. And what is that an experience of? It's an experience of discomfort, not fitting in, awareness of class bias, and indeed what's embedded in that, of course, is gender expectations. Her brother isn't asked to take the food to the family that's lost the provider. She is. And then finally, her use of epiphany is interesting and important. Many of her stories feature a character who has this dramatic insight, like an epiphany. But if we think about the garden party, we can identify it in those moments when she's down visiting the family, and both when she's observing the dead man on his deathbed and when she speaks to her brother. Now, critics have been disputing whether or not this epiphany means she came to some sort of peaceful understanding of the broader meaning of life, or whether she's about to say something about the horror of life. That part is left open. Laurie says to her, "Was it awful?" "No," sobbed Laura. "It was simply marvelous." "But Laurie," she stopped. She looked at her brother. "Isn't life?" she stammered. "Isn't life?" But what life was, she couldn't explain. So we know this character has had an epiphany and insight. We have a sense, if you look carefully at how she progresses to this point, that this may be a sort of resolving of conflict within her, an aha moment, helping ease her into the greater meaning of life. It may also have other meanings, and that's something it'll be interesting to talk about on the discussion board. So finally, I've just put up a few questions for us to think about as we read. I think these might help you to get into the sort of underlying meanings of the story. What role does the hat play in Laura's emerging consciousness of class bias? And you might even say gender bias. It's certainly relevant to gender as well. Her discomfort with the class biases of her world emerges well before the Carter is killed. So you might think about what other signs of this emerging consciousness come up in the story. Or we might consider what role her awareness of gender seemed to play in her consciousness raising, because gender is still very much a part of it, though it's a little bit more discrete than the class consciousness. And then finally, I would just be interested in whether you read the final lines, her sort of epiphany, as negative or positive. And as you consider that, you might look at that whole sequence when she's in the Carter's house. All right, I look forward to our discussion online and to hearing what you think of the story. Thanks.